The battle between the Australian light cruiser HMAS Sydney and the German auxiliary cruiser Cormoran was a single-ship action that occurred on 19 November 1941, off the coast of Western Australia. Sydney, with Captain Joseph Burnett commanding, and Cormoran, under Frigate Captain Theodore Detmers, encountered each other approximately 106 nautical miles off Dirk-Hartog Island, Western Australia. Both ships were destroyed in the half-hour engagement. From the 24th of November, after Sydney failed to return to port, air and sea searches were conducted. Boats and rafts carrying survivors from Cormoran were recovered at sea, while others made landfall north of Carnarvon. 318 of the 399 personnel on Cormoran survived. While debris from Sydney was found, there were no survivors from the 645-strong complement. It was the largest loss of life in the history of the Royal Australian Navy, the largest Allied warship lost with all hands during World War II, and a major blow to Australian wartime morale. Australian authorities learned of Sydney's fate from the surviving Cormoran personnel, who were held in prisoner of war camps until the end of the war. The exact location of the two wrecks remained unverified until 2008. Controversy has often surrounded the battle, especially in the years before the two wrecks were located in 2008. How and why a purpose-built warship like Sydney was defeated by a modified merchant vessel like Cormoran was the subject of speculation, with numerous books on the subject, as well as two official reports by government inquiries. According to German accounts, which were assessed as truthful and generally accurate by Australian interrogators during the war, as well as most subsequent analyses, Sydney approached so close to Cormoran that the Australian cruiser lost the advantages of heavier armour and superior gun range. Nevertheless, several post-war publications have alleged that Sydney's loss had been the subject of an extensive cover-up. The Germans had not followed the laws of war, Australian survivors were massacred following the battle, or the Empire of Japan had been secretly involved in the action. No evidence has been found to support any of these theories. Background: HMAS Sydney was one of three modified Leander or Perth-class light cruisers of the RAN. Built for the Royal Navy, the cruiser was purchased by the Australian government to replace HMAS Brisbane, and was commissioned into the RAN in September 1935. The cruiser was 562 feet 4 inches long, and displaced 8,940 long tons. Sydney carried 8 6-inch guns in 4 twin turrets as primary armament. These were supplemented by 4 4-inch anti-aircraft guns, 9 303-inch machine guns, and 8 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quadruple mountings. The cruiser also carried a single Supermarine Walrus amphibious aircraft. Initially assigned to escort and patrol duties in Australian waters, Sydney was sent to the Mediterranean in mid-1940. Sydney operated against Italian naval forces for 8 months, during which she participated in multiple battles, sank 2 Italian warships and several merchantmen, and supported convoy operations and shore bombardments. The cruiser was recalled to Australia in early January 1941. The need to rest the ship and personnel, plans to spread combat experience across the RAN fleet, and a desire to reinforce the nation following German radar activity in nearby waters were all factors. Sydney was assigned to Fremantle, Western Australia, and resumed escort and patrol duties. Command was handed over from Captain John Collins to Captain Joseph Burnett in May 1941. On the 11th of November, Sydney departed Fremantle for Singapore with the transport SS Zealandia. The vessels sailed to Sunday Strait, where the troopship was handed over on the 17th of November to HMS Durban. Sydney then turned for home, and was scheduled to arrive in Fremantle late on 20 November. At the time of the battle, she had a ship's company of 645, 41 officers, 594 sailors, 6 Royal Australian Air Force personnel, and 4 civilian canteen staff. Cormoran during the 1930s. Disparities between the conventional warship strength of the Kriegsmarine and other nations caused by the Treaty of Versailles led the German military to recognize that auxiliary cruisers engaged in commerce raiding would be of use during future wars, and that suitable vessels should be identified. The merchant ship Steiermark was one such vessel. She was taken up by the Kriegsmarine at the start of World War II. Renamed Cormoran, she was the largest and newest of 9 raiders, referred to as Hilfscruiser or Handelsstore cruiser. Cormoran was commissioned in October 1940. After modification, she was 515 feet long, and measured 8,736 GRT. The raider was fitted with 6 single 15-cm guns as main armament, supplemented by 2 37mm anti-tank guns, 5 20mm anti-aircraft autocannons, and 6 21-inch torpedo tubes. The 15-cm guns were concealed behind false hull plates and cargo hatch walls. The ship could be disguised as one of several Allied or neutral vessels. Cormoran departed German waters during December 1940, under the command of Fregattenkapitän Theodor Detmers. After operating in the Atlantic, during which time she sank 7 merchant ships and captured an 8th, the raider sailed to the Indian Ocean in late April 1941. Only 3 merchantmen were intercepted during the next 6 months, and Cormoran was diverted several times to refuel German support ships, as the raider was carrying several hundred sea mines and was expected to deploy some of these before returning home in early 1942. Detmers planned to mine shipping routes near Cape Leeuwin and Fremantle, but postponed this after detecting wireless signals from a warship in the area. Instead, he decided to sail north and investigate Shark Bay. At the time of the battle, the raider was disguised as the Dutch merchantman Straat Malakar, and carried 399 personnel, 36 officers, 359 sailors, and 4 Chinese sailors hired from the crew of a captured merchantman to run the ship's laundry. Battle. Note: all times in this section are UTC+7. Identification. On 19 November, shortly before 1600, Cormoran was 150 nautical miles southwest of Carnarvon, Western Australia. The raider was sailing northwards at 11 knots. At 15:55, what was initially thought to be a tall ship sail was sighted off the port bow, although it was quickly determined to be the mast of a warship. Detmers ordered Cormoran to alter course into the sun at maximum achievable speed because of problems in one of her diesel engines. While setting the ship to action stations, Sydney spotted the German's ship around the same time, and altered from her southward heading to intercept at 25 knots. As she closed the gap, the Australian cruiser requested that Cormoran identify herself. Communications were initially attempted with a signal lamp to repeatedly send NNJ, but those aboard the raider did not understand the uncommonly used signal and did not respond. Sydney continued to signal for 30 minutes, after which those aboard the cruiser used flags to send the more common VH signal, while the signal lamp was used to transmit the message in plain language. After another delay, Cormoran raised PKQI, the call sign for the Dutch merchant ship Straat Malakar, on the Triatic stay and hoisted a Dutch merchant ensign. As Sydney was approaching from just starboard of Cormoran's stern and 15,000 meters away, the call sign was obscured by the raider's funnel. Sydney signalled, "Make your signal letters clear," which the signals officer aboard Cormoran did by lengthening the halyard and swinging it around to starboard. By 1635, with Sydney 8,000 meters away, the malfunctioning engine aboard Cormoran was repaired, but Detmers chose to keep it in reserve. Sydney asked Cormoran, "Where bound?" to which the raider responded, "Batavia." Sydney may have then made signals asking for the raider's port of origin and cargo. The Germans who claimed this said their replies were Fremantle and peace goods, respectively. At around 1700, Detmers instructed his wireless operators to send a false distress signal indicating that Strat Malacca was being approached by a suspicious ship. The message, transmitted at 1703 and repeated at 1705, contained the distress call for a merchantman under attack from a raider instead of a warship, the latitude and longitude of the transmitting ship, the time per Greenwich Mean Time, and the ship's name. This signal was partially received by the tugboat UCO and a shore station at Geraldton. The Geraldine station broadcast a message to all ships asking if there was anything to report, but after no response was forthcoming, ignored it until a report on the signal was forwarded to the Naval Board on the 27th of November. During the exchanges and distress signal, Sydney positioned herself just off the raider's starboard beam on a parallel course, approximately 1,300 meters from Cormoran. The cruiser may or may not have been at action stations. The main guns and port torpedo launcher were trained on Cormoran, and her Walrus scout plane had been readied for launch, prompting Detmers to prepare to engage Sydney, but her 4-inch guns were unmanned, and personnel were standing on the upper deck. During her maneuver, Sydney appeared to signal, "OK," which Cormoran did not respond to, as from their perspective, such a signal did not make sense. The Germans were unaware that the letters were the interior of Strat Malacca's secret call sign, IKP. To verify her identity, the ship had to signal back the outer letters. The aircraft was shut down by 1725, and the catapult swung into the storage position. The two ships were too close for a safe launch. At around 1730, after the raider had failed to reply for 15 minutes, Sydney signaled by light, "Show your secret sign." Detmers knew that Cormoran was in trouble. Action in response to the cruiser's signal, Detmers ordered that Cormoran's disguise be dropped, for the Dutch flag to be replaced by the Kriegsmarine ensign, and for the guns and torpedoes to open fire. Accounts disagree on which ship fired first, but agree that both opened fire almost simultaneously. The first shots from Sydney, a full 8-shell salvo from the main guns, were reported in most accounts to have passed over Cormoran, although some of the Germans said that shells punched through the funnel and the wireless office at bridge level without exploding, and hit the water on the far side of the raider. One analysis claims that this was either a warning shot just over the superstructure, or an attempt to destroy the raider's bridge as a prelude to capture. With Cormoran's opening salvo, the gunnery officer attempted to bracket the cruiser's bridge but failed to hit it, with the shells striking other parts of the ship or missing completely. Two torpedoes from Cormoran's starboard above water tubes were launched simultaneously with the raider's attack, and the close proximity of the target allowed the use of the anti-aircraft and close defense guns to rake Sydney's flank, thus preventing the use of the cruiser's secondary weapons. Subsequent salvos from the raider were more accurate. The second 3-shell salvo destroyed Sydney's bridge and damaged her upper superstructure, including the gun direction control tower, wireless offices, and foremast. The fourth 15-centimeter gun was ready by this time, and all four began to fire. The third and fourth salvos knocked the cruiser's A and B turrets out of action before they could fire a second time, and the fifth hit Sydney on the waterline in proximity to the forward engine room, although one shell hit high and destroyed the Walrus. Cormoran's guns were aimed at Sydney's waterline and upper deck during the next 3 salvos. After the sixth German salvo, Sydney resumed fire with her aft turrets. Y turret fired less than 4 times with little effect, but multiple shots from X turret struck Cormoran, damaging the raider's machinery spaces, wounding the sailors manning one of the guns, and starting a fire in an oil tank. Around the time of the 8th or 9th German salvo, one of the 2 torpedoes fired at the start of the engagement struck Sydney just forward of a turret and near the Aztec compartment, ripping a hole in the side and causing the bow of the cruiser to angle down. After the torpedo strike, Sydney turned hard to port. The Germans assumed that the Australian ship was trying to ram them, but the cruiser passed aft. During the turn, the 10th German salvo tore the roof from B turret and destroyed A turret's housing. The main phase of the engagement ended around 1735, with Sydney heading south and slowing, while Cormoran maintained her course and speed. Sydney's main armament was completely disabled, and her secondary weapons were out of range. The cruiser was wreathed in smoke from fires burning in the engine room and forward superstructure, and around the aircraft catapult. Cormoran discontinued salvo firing, but the individually firing aft guns scored hits as Sydney crossed the raider's stern. At around 1745, Sydney fired 2 torpedoes from her starboard tubes. Prior to the torpedo launch, HMAS had decided to destroy Sydney completely, and ordered the raider to turn to port so 4 gun salvos could be fired. This maneuver caused the torpedoes to pass astern of Cormoran. After completing the turn, battle damage caused Cormoran's engines to fail completely, leaving the raider dead in the water while Sydney continued to sail southwards at low speed. Cormoran maintained a high rate of fire despite being immobilized. Some sailors claimed that up to 450 shells were used during the second phase of the battle, and scored hits on the cruiser, although many shells missed as the range increased. The raider fired her guns for the last time around 1750, with the range at 6,600 yards, and a torpedo was launched at 1800 but missed Sydney. Conclusion: by the end of the 30-minute battle, the ships were about 10,000 meters apart. Both were heavily damaged and on fire. Sydney was proceeding on a south-southeast bearing, apparently not under control. The Australian warship quickly disappeared from German sight, although the glow of the burning ship consistently lit the horizon until 2200, with some German survivors stating that the light was visible consistently or occasionally until midnight. Sydney sank during the night. It was originally thought that the cruiser exploded when fires reached the shell magazines or torpedo launches, or took on water through the shell holes on her port side and capsized. However, after the wrecks were located, it was determined that Sydney was under limited control after the battle, maintaining a course of 130 to 140 degrees true at speeds of 1.5 knots. The ship remained afloat for up to 4 hours before the bow tore off and dropped almost vertically under the weight of the anchors and chains. The rest of the ship sank shortly afterward, and glided upright for 500 meters underwater until it hit the seabed stern first. Cormoran was stationary, and at 1825 HMAS ordered the ship to be abandoned, as damage to the raider's engine room had knocked out the firefighting systems, and there was no way to control or contain the oil fire before it reached the magazines or the mine hold. All boats and life rafts were launched by 2100, and all but one filled. A skeleton crew manned the weapons while the officers prepared to scuttle the ship. Cormoran was abandoned at midnight. The ship sank slowly until the mine hold exploded 30 minutes later. The German survivors were in 5 boats and 2 rafts. 1 cutter carrying 46 men, 2 damaged steel life rafts with 57 and 62 aboard, 1 workboat carrying 72 people, 1 boat with 31 men aboard, and 2 rafts, each bearing 26 sailors. During the evacuation, a rubber life raft carrying 60 people, mostly wounded, sank without warning, drowning all but 3 aboard. Total German casualties were 6 officers, 75 German sailors, and 1 Chinese laundryman.